Today I'm joined by Walter Block, a man whose CV cannot possibly be encapsulated in a blurb. Suffice it to say he is a professor of economics at Loyola University, a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, the author and editor of dozens of books and hundreds of peer-reviewed papers on a wide range of subjects touching on economics, politics, and individual freedom. Mr. Block, thank you for joining me today on the Corbett Report.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
All right. I want to get into the ideas and ideals of libertarianism today, but first I think it would be useful to define our terms. So, what is libertarianism? It seems to me to contain the elements of an economic philosophy, of a political philosophy, perhaps even of a moral philosophy, but I'm not sure it can be comfortably categorized within any of those terms.
Well, it's sort of complicated. It fits all three. I would say libertarianism is based on liberty, as its name implies. The idea is that we should promote liberty. Liberty is groovy. Liberty is great. Liberty is the best thing for the human being. And promotion of liberty is what libertarianism is all about. More specifically, there are two basic axioms, each of which is the opposite side of the same coin. The first basic axiom is the non-aggression axiom. Namely, there is only one proper way that I can deal with you, and that is voluntarily, not through aggression. If I want your shoes, for example, there's only one way to get it, and that is to get your agreement. I can offer you money, I can promise to be your best friend forever, I can trade something for you, but unless and until you agree to give me those shoes, I can't get those shoes. The illegitimate ways, the ways that are incompatible with libertarianism would be if I pulled a knife on you and said, give me your shoes or I'll, cut you. That's one part of libertarianism. The other part of libertarianism, or the opposite side of the coin, is property rights. You suppose I just grab your shoes. Have I violated your rights? Have I initiated aggression? Well, it depends upon who owns the shoes. If you stole those shoes from me yesterday and I'm just recovering them today, well, then my act of seizing your shoes is not aggression, it's defense. It's compatible with libertarianism. We have to have a theory of property rights, and libertarians do. It's based on the Lockean, Rothbardian, Hoppian notion of homesteading, where we first get to own our own bodies, and then we get to own those parts of nature that we mix our labor with, and then we get to own those bits of reality that we get to through a voluntary process compatible with a non-aggression axiom, namely trade or gifts or something like that. So that's libertarianism in a nutshell, and it certainly applies to economics. It says that the only economic interaction that's legitimate is compatible with a non-aggression axiom and property rights. It's not really compatible with morality. It's different than morality. It's sort of a political philosophy. It asks only one question: under what conditions is force justified, and it gives only one answer, and there's a prior use of force against private property. It's not exactly the same as morality, because you can do things that are immoral and still be compatible with libertarianism. For example, use drugs or weird sex practices or whatever. That is between consenting adults. So it's not exactly morality. It's certainly political and economic. It says that only politics that is compatible with libertarianism is legitimate. And Ron Paul, perhaps, is the most famous libertarian politician, where in his view, a minarchist view, minimal government libertarianism, that government is best which governs least, and he's very serious about that.
Absolutely, and I'd like to get into the Ron Paul revolution coming up shortly, but first, what is anarcho-capitalism, and how is that related to libertarianism?
Well, there are two branches of libertarianism. The minarchist, or minimal government libertarian, says that government has one legitimate function, and that is to protect persons and property against aggression. And to that end, it has three legitimate institutions: armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and courts to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are. The anarcho-libertarians are equally libertarian, although most libertarians are not anarchists. I would say 90% are minarchists and 10% are anarchists. And the anarcho-libertarian would say, well, yes, even this function should be done by the private enterprise system, because private enterprise is compatible with non-aggression, whereas government does two things that make it incompatible with libertarianism, namely, it taxes you against your will, and it insists upon a monopoly. It won't allow other government services or other defense services to be autonomous within its claimed monopoly area. So there's a little tension between the two versions of libertarianism, but they agree on pretty much 99% of government. It should be stopped, and what's left of the 1 or 5% of government, we can argue about after we reduce it by 95%.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump into the heart of the matter and flesh out something you brought up earlier. You mentioned the homesteading theory as the libertarian way of deriving the justification for private property, and I think this is an important point because I think it's something that distinguishes libertarian philosophy from pretty much every other political philosophy, and that's, in libertarian philosophy, private property rights are sacrosanct. And I'd like you to, if you could just flesh out that homesteading theory of private property rights a little bit in a little bit greater detail.
Okay, sure. I think that's a very good question. First, we get to own our own bodies. I don't know about you, but I've got kids, and they sort of homesteaded themselves. When they were just newborns, I could kiss them all the time and hug them, and they sort of didn't insist on any property rights in themselves. But after a while, after maybe 6 months or a year, I forget exactly when, they're big now, but they started, they learned the word no, and then, they would sort of push me away when I was kissing them too much, and they would learn the idea of mine and the distinction between them and me and other people. It's sort of when the human being, the child grows up, he or she sort of seizes control of or homesteads their own body. Initially, a baby just kicks aimlessly and does everything aimlessly, but eventually they start taking control. So in a sense, they're homesteading their own bodies. Okay, let's assume that we all agree that we're all self-owners. There's no such thing as slavery that it would be justified by libertarianism, although there is such a thing as voluntary slavery, but that's a very fine point. Coercive slavery of the sort that we had in 1861 or before in the U.S. would be verboten, because that's kidnapping, that's theft of a body, as would rape or murder. Okay, well now we're all self-owners, we're a whole bunch of people, and now we're living on this earth and it's virgin territory, everything is virgin. Well, how do we decide who gets to do what? Well, the libertarian homesteading theory is he who is first to mix his labor with the land or to homestead it or to farm it or whatever has the best claim on it. So suppose I start farming land and I grow corn. I clear the land, I put corn seeds in it, and up sprouts corn. You next door, my neighbor, domesticate this wild cow, and now you tame it and you get milk out of it. Well, I own the corn because I mixed my labor with it, I produced it. You own the milk because you domesticated the cow. And now, Robert Nozick talks about other ways of interacting in a voluntary basis. Well, I trade you some corn for some milk. And now I own the milk even though I didn't produce it, and you own the corn even though you didn't produce it, but we can trace this ownership of the milk and the corn back to homesteading and voluntary trade.
All right, well, I think that the problem that many people have with the libertarian ideology is its faith in the free market. And there are many people out there who fear that the unfettered operation of the markets will lead necessarily to the complete monopolization of the economy by a few powerful interests. And essentially, I guess the fear is that without government intervention, there will always be a Standard Oil, and you'll always have a few Rockefellers in control of the economy. And what is your response to this fear?
Well, first of all, when you say unfettered, it really is fettered. The fetters would be the non-aggression axiom. In other words, if John D. Rockefeller or Bill Gates or any of those types, if the way they get their money is by seizing it, by grabbing it against the will of other people, well, then they go to jail because they're violating the non-aggression axiom. But the way John Rockefeller and Bill Gates made their money was through voluntary trade. Every time Bill Gates sold a computer, or every time John D. Rockefeller sold a barrel of oil, they sold it at a price that was mutually beneficial. Otherwise, the people who bought the things, whether computers or oil, wouldn't have bought it. So suppose John D. Rockefeller sells me a barrel of oil for $20. Well, I must value the oil more than $20, otherwise why would I do it? And he values my $20 more than the oil, otherwise why would he do it? So trade is mutually, necessarily, in the ex ante sense of anticipation, is mutually beneficial. So how can anyone harm anyone if through voluntary trade? Yes, John D. Rockefeller got very rich, but he enriched everyone else. Yes, Bill Gates got rich, but he enriched everyone else. So Bill Gates can't take over anything. John D. Rockefeller can't take over anything. If nuclear power came into power in a way that we didn't need any oil, well, then John D. Rockefeller would be gone. Or if somebody invented a substitute for the computer, well, Bill Gates, he's got no real power. Whereas if you contrast this with the way the government does it, with the way a pirate does it, well, he gets rich, but he reduces the wealth of everyone else because he steals everything from other people. So there are really only two ways of going about this. One is the laissez-faire capitalist way, which is mutually beneficial, and the other is the coercive governmental or criminal way, which increases the wealth of some at the expense of others. Bill Gates and John D. Rockefeller didn't make any money at the expense of anyone else. They made money by helping other people.
I see the point, but I think that also when you look at the history of something like Standard Oil, the way that the Rockefellers were able to come to power through Standard Oil was by bottlenecking the access to markets or the access to resources and creating a cartel that was involved in price fixing. And I think that, in a way, in a free market economy, you're always going to have that type of cartel system when there's a limited access to a certain resource or a limited access to the market.
Well, I disagree with that way of characterizing it. I think that this gets the history of it all wrong, pretty much backwards, pretty much the opposite of the truth. The way John D. Rockefeller made his money was not by bottlenecking anything. It was by discovering oil and refining oil. And yes, he made cooperative agreements with other people, but cooperative agreements are voluntary and compatible with the non-aggression axiom. You know, there's that expression, I'm firm, you're stubborn, he's a pig-headed fool. Well, similarly, I'm a cooperator, you're a cartelizer. It's just silly. Cartelization is just a merger of two companies who agree. Look, husband and wife get together and they make a cartel and they agree not to trade with others in certain ways, namely sexual services if they're monogamous. I think there's just a very silly way of looking at it that when businessmen combine companies and merge and they can better serve the public, well, the public is better off. And if the merger or the cartel didn't work, well, then they'd lose money and they'd go broke, which is something that doesn't happen with government enterprise. When they screw up, like FEMA or the Army Corps of Engineers, they're still in business. When a businessman doesn't serve the public, he goes broke.
All right, well, let's step back for a moment, and granting that libertarian society is what we're aiming towards, what is the feasibility of bringing this society into existence? How can we transition from a partly socialized system like the one we're living in to an entirely free system without the process of transition being used or taken over by unscrupulous peoples to their personal advantage? And I'm thinking, for example, in regards to privatization of the apparatus of the state, how can we do that in a way that the private, when it falls into private hands, it's not done so in an unfair way?
Well, one example of what you're saying is pretty much the Soviet Union. They privatized vast amounts of stuff, and they did it in very unfair ways by pretty much the communist apparatchiks just sort of grabbed the property and said, well, it's ours now. It's now ours as private individuals as opposed to Communist Party functionaries. So that would be not a fair way to go about it, although I'm pretty sure that the Soviet Union is way better off now when they have quasi-free enterprise, not full free enterprise, than they were under communism. China is another example of, a country that was engaged in mass starvation, and look at them now. They've had GDP growth of some 10% a year for the last 10, 15 years. They've gotten out of semi-starvation, and now they're becoming a modern economy. They've done better. India is loosening up its economic socialist limitations, and it's doing better. There's no guarantee that the transition period will work out perfectly, but it's certainly worth transitioning from communism or socialism to laissez-faire capitalism, or at least movements in that direction.
I see. So, what do you think a libertarian society would ultimately look like? How would it differ from today's society?
Well, it looks very much like today's society, except that you wouldn't have to pay half the GDP in taxes, and you wouldn't have all these regulations, nail clippers and stuff, and if there, you wouldn't have the U.S. government having 800 foreign military bases in about 130 different countries, and creating havoc all around the world, and having terrorist threats, and having to watch about nail clippers, and having the TSA watch about airlines and stuff. It would be pretty much like today without the government having its claws on the entire economy. We'd be very much richer. It's sort of like, I guess, comparing countries that are relatively free with those that are relatively unfree, and compare say Africa with North America. We have much more free enterprise than the Africans and the South Americans, and that's why they're relatively poor. So I would say that what it would look like would be, the government would be very, very minimal. It would be limited to the army, courts, and police if you go along with the anarchist view. And people would be much wealthier, I presume happier, fewer regulations, less of our wealth going to nonsensical government programs, and people would spend their money to improve themselves. We'd all be driving around in Cadillacs, and we'd have a much better health system, and everything would run better because socialism doesn't work. It doesn't work in the Soviet Union, doesn't work in China, it doesn't work in the U.S. One of my favorites is privatization of highways. I'm just coming out with a book on that, and some 40,000 people a year die on the U.S. highways, socialist highways. Well, if we had private highways, you might have deaths of a few hundred people a year instead of 40,000 a year. This is a problem that no one talks about. So life would be richer and safer under free enterprise.
I see, and I understand that you had a debate with Milton Friedman on that issue.
Oh yes, Milton Friedman is a road socialist. A socialist in many other ways too. He is not. He's happy with the present situation with highways, and the fact that 40,000 people a year die on them doesn't seem to bother him too much. It bothers me a lot. I think it's a horrendous thing that 40,000 people a year die on the bloody U.S. highways, and it's similar in many other countries as well, although my own research mainly focuses on the U.S. This is horrible. This is a tragedy. And it's not even in the news. Barack Obama and John McCain are now having an election contest, and this is not an issue, and yet the highways kill so many thousands of people. It's just horrendous. It's disgusting. It's despicable. It's socialist.
Well, getting into the detail of that, how specifically will privatization help reduce the number of deaths on the roads?
Well, different people will own different roads, and they'll compete among the things upon which they will compete is road safety. Look, right now, if you have a 10-car smack-up on Highway 1, does anyone in a position to change anything lose money? No, it's the bloody government that owns Highway 1, whether it's federal or state, it doesn't matter. But if you owned Highway 1 and I had a competing road, Highway 2, next to it, I'd have an ad out in the paper saying, or on the web or wherever saying, go to the James Highway, Highway 1, and it's a death trap. Come to the Block Highway, which is a lot safer now. We'll charge a little more, but you won't take your life in your hands, and you'll go broke. And then my better safety mechanisms will prevail and spread out, just like Bill Gates' computers beat out his competitors, and like the Honda and Toyota beat out other cars. In other words, we believe in competition for everything. We believe in competition for shoes and eyeglasses and shirts and books and toys. Well, why not apply competition, private property rights to this area where it's never been applied to?
Well, I think it is quite an obvious ideal to strive towards, the idea that competition will solve the problems. What then do you think is the appeal in the opposite tendency, and why is that notion that we do need government control over things like highways so prevalent?
Well, most people, if you give them the libertarian non-aggression axiom, they'll say, sure. I mean, my neighbors, they don't come over and grab my lawnmower at the point of a gun. They'll ask to borrow it. We trade things, and we give each other cookies and lemonade, and we react in a very civilized manner. But when people get into the ballot box, they vote for people who don't favor libertarianism. And I have a theory as to why this is, and my theory is that we're hardwired for socialism. Why do I say that we're hardwired for socialism? Well, because of sociobiological conditions. Namely, sociobiology is the study of why it is that we are the way we are, and the answer that they give is that the reason we are the way we are is because of what the requirements were for survival a million or 500,000 years ago when we were swinging from trees and in caves. And what I learned from this is that we are hardwired to accept explicit cooperation, namely I help you, you help me, like good neighbors do. But we're not at all hardwired to accept implicit cooperation through markets. Namely, the caveman didn't have private enterprise and people weren't selected for that. Whereas if you couldn't cooperate a million years ago and you didn't help people and you weren't friendly, you probably wouldn't have survived and left children for the next generation. Let me give you an example of this. I am a professor at Loyola University, which is in New Orleans, and we had Katrina in 2005. And when Katrina struck, the prices of all sorts of things rose through the roof. There was criticism of gouging. For example, what we needed in desperate plight, what we needed were things like water, milk, orange juice, flashlight batteries, candles, gasoline, things that you really need in a crisis. And based on supply and demand, the price of these things catapulted into the atmosphere. Now, we as economists know that the benefits of higher prices during crises like this are two. One, we'll be able to ration these goods. Like if the first 100 people into Walmart grab everything at the old prices, there'll be nothing left for the other 900 people behind them. Whereas if the price of orange juice is $20 a quart, well, then you're not going to grab it all. You leave some for other people. So we'll act in a more civilized manner at those higher prices. Second, and more important, high prices mean high profits, and high profits are an attraction for entrepreneurs to come from, I don't know where, Texas or Mexico or Canada or Montana, and bring this stuff to New Orleans because we're in dire need of it. So high prices have a very good effect from an economic perspective, and yet people were hardwired to see this as an abomination. They called it gouging. The governor of Louisiana threatened to put people in jail for raising prices under these crisis conditions. So the reason, to get back to your question, I'm sorry I have to be so long-winded. I'm a professor. If I directly answer the question, they might kick me out of the topic. So I have to let this circuitous route. But to answer your question now, finally, the reason that people are not as receptive to free enterprise as they might be is because they're hardwired to not accept it because of socio-biological conditions. When the governor said we're going to throw price gougers in jail, everyone applauded. But this is against the free enterprise system. The free enterprise system means that when you have shortages, prices rise. And when prices rise, profits rise. And when profits rise, this leads Adam Smith's invisible hand to get into gear, and other entrepreneurs come and help us. But we're not hardwired for that. We're more hardwired for FEMA or somebody like that, central government socialism, come help us. That's why the libertarian candidates get 2, 3, 5% and aren't elected to president or things like that.
Well, I'd like to get into that issue in a moment, but Walter Block, getting onto the subject of prices determining people's behavior, what role does monetary policy play in that? And what does the libertarian perspective have to say about money itself and its creation?
Well, libertarians apply the non-aggression axiom and free choice and property rights to everything, and money is no exception. We need money because of the problem of the double coincidence of wants. If we were going to have barter, we didn't have money, we'd have to trade with barter, and we have to trade because otherwise, if we don't trade, then we just produce for ourselves without trading. We'll be jacks of all trades, and we'll all die because you can't have much efficiency if you have to produce everything you need. So, you make shoes and I make wristwatches, and then we trade. But it's very hard to trade without money because you have this thing, the double coincidence of wants. If I want to trade you shoes for wristwatches, I have to find a person who's got a shoe in the size I want and wants a wristwatch that I've made, and the odds of that are very low. So what people did under free enterprise is they would, if they had a wristwatch and they wanted shoes, they would trade the wristwatch in for something that pretty much everyone wants, like salt or fish hooks or cowrie shells or tobacco or something like that. And then they would take that and make a second trade and take that other thing, sometimes gold. Gold actually was used, and then they would buy the shoes. So what makes for good money? Good money or money is a trade intermediary. And what makes for a good one? Well, you can't have bananas as money because the stuff rots, and when you try to make the second trade, the bananas are all rotten, so they're not good. Gold was always a very good money because people, you could make change in it, whereas diamonds you couldn't. If you broke a diamond to make change, it would lose a lot of its value, and it's very hard to break a diamond, whereas gold is a soft metal. It doesn't atrophy like a banana. So gold was the money, sometimes silver, other places copper, that was chosen by free choice of individuals, and that's why libertarians favor the gold standard, not because there's any fetish for gold, it's because that's what people always chose. If somehow we now chose platinum, that would be fine too. Whatever people choose is the libertarian motto.
Well, of course, these days paper is the medium of choice, and I guess there's no theoretical reason against that. But can you speak to the debate between fiat money versus asset-backed money?
Oh, yes. Well, when you say today paper money is the choice, I wouldn't really go along with that because what happened is that the government got involved in this and seized people's gold. They made it illegal to trade. They have legal tender laws. Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke out tie with gold in 32, I think it was, and Nixon closed the gold international window. I think it was 72. I'm not sure of the exact date. So gold has been pretty much outlawed, like pot or like heroin or prostitution or what have you. It's like a victimless crime. The reason for this is that it's very hard for the government to inflate gold. They just can't do it. And from looking at it from the government's point of view, the problem with taxes for them is that everyone knows who's doing it. The problem with borrowing is, again, everyone knows who's doing it. The beauty of inflation and fiat currency and fractional reserve banking is that this is a very sophisticated thing. It's hard to see that the government is involved in it. Rather, the government blames greedy landlords or greedy businessmen or greedy unionists or greedy consumers. So they can get away with a lot more of our GDP with a paper standard than they could with a gold standard. That's why they are very much opposed to a gold standard.
So is the answer then the return to the gold standard?
Oh, yeah. Well, not so much a return to the gold standard, but a return to libertarianism and a return to free choice. And it just so happens that historically, whenever people were free to choose, they chose gold. So I would predict that they would pick gold, but who knows? Maybe they'll pick platinum or copper this time. That doesn't matter. But yes, a return to the gold standard would be the way out of this quandary.
All right. Well, turning back to the political situation, you mentioned the current Obama/McCain political debates. But of course, recently the Ron Paul revolution did sweep across America and did make quite a big impact on the political scene, I think, and changed the public discourse and thinking to reintroduce libertarian ideas and ideals to the American electorate. And I'm wondering, why do you think in recent years the libertarian idea has gained such traction with the public?
Well, it's gained such traction only given, our hard wiring against it. So when you say it's gained such traction, Ron Paul got, 10, 12% of some of the elections, 8 or 6%. That's magnificent compared to previous libertarian returns, and that's due to Ron Paul. I mean, he is the Mozart of libertarianism. He is a person who can articulate our views in the most magnificent way. By the way, he'll be having a counter demonstration against the Republican convention in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I think it's next week. But still, why isn't he now the Republican candidate? Why did McCain beat him? Well, you saw the way that the mainstream media treated him, that they would not ask him questions of the debate. They would cut him off. They were very nasty to him. They would try to make fun of him. So he did Herculean task. He did a magnificent job of promoting liberty. But given the context, it's sort of like pushing the rock up Sisyphus. The rock keeps coming down, keeps having to push it up. I fear that libertarians are fated to have the rock of Sisyphus, trying to push it up. Yes, Ron Paul is magnificent. He's perhaps the best exponent of libertarianism in modern times. He's convinced more people of libertarianism than anyone else. Ayn Rand, I would say, took that role a decade or two or three ago, where she popularized libertarianism, even though she renounced the libertarian label. So he did magnificent work, but, where are we? He's not going to be the president of the U.S. He's got a counter demonstration. Now, I think it's wonderful what he's done, and I hope that more and more people repair to his banner, so to speak. And I hope that young people will study his works and the works of other libertarians and will promote liberty that way. But the difficulty is that, as I say, we're biased against liberty, and it's a tough row to hoe.
Well, on a strategic note, do you see any way for libertarians to capitalize on the momentum from the Ron Paul movement?
Well, Ron Paul is setting up this new group which will promote liberty. There's a group called the Mises Institute that promotes liberty, and I'm a big advocate of that. There are many professors in colleges, including myself, who promote free enterprise, Austrian economics, private property rights. There are more of us now than there were ever before. I got into the movement in 1962, I guess, and there were just a handful. Now there are thousands of us, and it's snowballing, and when you start with zero, any progress is very big in percentage terms. So libertarianism is on the march, it's on the rise, and it's just very small compared to the way I'd like it to be.
All right. Well, how can people find out more about yourself and about libertarianism in general?
Well, myself, just email me, wblock@loyno.edu, Loyno, WBLOCK@LOYNO.edu. Go to the Mises web, MISES. Ludwig von Mises was one of the great scholars of liberty in the past century. Read the literature on the Mises web and come to some of its events. And I think we're going to need some more students, what with Gustav after Katrina. So if you're of college age, come on down to Loyola. We've got an entire economics department that's dedicated to free enterprise and private property rights. And, go to some of the websites of other libertarian think tanks and acquaint yourself with liberty and come on in. The water's fine.
Okay, an enticing offer indeed. Well, let's end it on that note. Walter Block, thank you very much for joining me today on the Corbett Report.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.